Middle East expert Lisa Daftari as CNN's national security analyst Gail Samak-Lamont and CNN military analyst retired Lieutenant Colonel Rick Francona. Gail, first to you, those images from Raqqa, this is just a wasteland. You know, and a spokesman for Inherent Resolve said the joint operation warned the city is still not safe. Listen to this.
We must clear the remnants of all the explosives that have been left in Raqqa throughout this battle. One of the SDF commanders earlier in the campaign, maybe a month ago, said that the fight in Raqqa is more about a fight against IEDs and explosives than it is against ISIS.
Okay, but essentially, you know, this place is just booby-trapped like you could not believe. You know, trying to find these IEDs and the explosives is going to take a lot of time. But at the end of the day, this is a victory which has come with a very, very heavy cost.
A very heavy cost. I mean, I was there at the end of August on the front lines in Raqqa, and what is striking about it is it feels absolutely deserted and like straight out of a science fiction film, because the devastation is complete and it's thorough, and there are so many Syrian families who have been displaced from Raqqa. We met, when we were there, a woman who was 8 months pregnant, walked out of Raqqa city facing ISIS snipers and attacks and the threat of coalition air attacks. And she, with thousands of others, are now waiting in a camp in Ainisa, not too far from Raqqa, waiting to go home. And when you talk to people from Raqqa, what they say is, we want to go back and we want to start again.
And Lisa, this is what we forget. We forget about the fact that this is a city, yes, it was under ISIS control, but there are hundreds of thousands of mums and dads and kids living there, living amongst 4 months of hell, right, as long as this military operation lasts.
Even before that.
Yeah, under ISIS control.
Right,
terrible,
before it was even under ISIS control. The vulnerability, it's a war-torn country. Every inch of that country experiencing different yet the same type of crises. And now the bigger question tonight is that nightmare is not over. Do they get to go back? What will happen? What's the future going to look like?
Do they go back to?
Will that, right, and will the continued vacuum create another terror organization? Will ISIS come back? Now it's, you know, as you said, booby-trapped. They don't know where the next attack is coming from, so they're still walking on eggshells. They're still living this precarious life that is, you know, yet to be determined.
Colonel Francona, for months, ISIS militants, they've been heading to the southeast to Deir el-Zor. Ultimately, just a few thousand militants were left behind to defend Raqqa. What's the assessment of how many ISIS fighters actually remain in the region? Will there still be significant military operations to come?
Oh, yeah, of course. You know, there are thousands left. It's just how effective they can be. You know, there are fighters from Raqqa that have made their way down to Deir el-Zor. Deir el-Zor and that area to the southeast of it in the Euphrates Valley is where everybody is gathering. We believe that's where the final battle will take place, not just in Syria, but they are, what's left of ISIS in Iraq will also end up in that area, and that will be the end of ISIS as a territorial entity. But I think it's important that we remember that ISIS will not be defeated by its loss of territory. It will go on as a terrorist organization. It's just going to change its messaging, it's going to change its methods, and of course it's going to change its footprint. They may pop up somewhere else geographically, but they will still have some presence in Iraq and Syria. We see that primarily in Iraq right now, where they're starting to recruit online for what they know will be the follow-on to the current situation.
We'll talk about that a little more in a moment, but Lisa, I do want to get to the point about this Arab-Kurdish alliance in the fight to retake Raqqa. This was always not exactly the happiest, most comfortable partnership here. Now that the common enemy is essentially defeated, what happens to that alliance and what happens to Raqqa?
Right, again, that elephant in the room is that we're on opposite sides, yet we're fighting that common enemy. And what happens when that common enemy disappears, or for the moment at least disappears, is now the Assad forces have to decide what they're going to do with the Kurds. And the referendum that was pushed through last week, or at least the initiative for the Kurds to really push for the state, which they've been pushing for forever, but to actually come to the point to say, look at what we've done for the world. We're the strongest forces on the ground. The U.S. needs us. The coalition needs us. The Arabs need us to do their dirty work. And now that we have, look where we're at. I think it's going to be an interesting moment to see where the Arabs stand with regards to the Kurds and what that does for the future of the Kurdish people.
I mean, Gail, this is a much wider question, goes sort of beyond Raqqa, but everything that the Kurdish Peshmerga and the Kurdish government have done in this fight against ISIS, is it fair to say they're owed?
when you would speak with Syrian Kurdish leadership, which is different than Iraqi Kurdish leadership, right? Exactly. But they would say, listen, you know, they didn't want Raqqa as a city. What they want is self-governance. And what you see on the ground in northern Syria, in the places that Syrian Kurds and Syrian Arabs are now holding together as part of this SDF coalition, are these local councils, mayoralties, you know, people trying to get services going, trying to bring cities back to life. We were in Manbij, which was liberated a year ago, right? There is a civil council that's up and running. Will any of that last, right? What happens if the Syrian regime comes in backed with Russian air power to retake that? What will the Americans do? Because three words have never been answered the entire time we've talked about the Syrian conflict, which is, and then what? Yeah. What happens next?
Well, and to you, Colonel Francona, I mean, the Syrian government, Raqqa is legally, it's part of Syria. I mean, you can talk about the morals and all the rest of it, but, you know, the Syrian government and the forces loyal to Bashar al-Assad, you know, do they have a right to go back in and try and take Raqqa?
Yeah, sure. And I think all we need to do is look at what's happening in northern Iraq right now. There is precedent being set, and I'm sure it's not lost on Bashar al-Assad. He's watching what the Iraqi government is doing. They're moving into areas that are technically not part of the Kurdish regional government, but that the Kurds have occupied since 2014. And that was okay as long as the Iraqis needed them to stand on that territory and defend it from ISIS. But now that ISIS is gone, and I think that both of these experts have made some good points here about what happens next. And I think we're seeing it play out in Iraq, and I think Bashar al-Assad is looking at this, and that's how he wants to play it out in Syria. I don't think the Kurds in Syria are going to get any consideration from the central government in Damascus. Bashar al-Assad wants it all. He said that. And will he turn the Syrian army on the Kurds? I don't know. But and the big question is, what will the Americans do? I think we're going to be asked to leave by both the Iraqis, and I think we're going to be forced out of Syria. I don't see a win here for the U.S.
Well, at least what happens if the U.S. is forced to leave?
You know, we'll have to make that decision. What will that seat at the table mean for us, and what will that absence at the table mean for us? So if we do stay, and right now I think the U.S. has provided and promised to continue to provide humanitarian aid to the Syrians in the nation-building phase, which will take decades. I mean, it's very juvenile to think that this is going to be something that we can decide overnight. But I think what's more important is to decide what that plan of action will be and how it will behoove or not behoove U.S. assets to be involved in that discussion or not be involved in that discussion.
Gail, I'm wondering, could all of this have been avoided if this whole situation with ISIS, when it swept into power back in 2014, if the Iraqis had agreed to a U.S. stabilization force of 10,000 troops remaining behind in Iraq? Now, you can argue over the reasons for it, why it was a complete withdrawal, but if there was 10,000 U.S. or 15,000 U.S. troops in Iraq, would they have been able to stop ISIS and all of this have been avoided?
The counterfactuals abound in this, right? Because you could start with that, the status of forces agreement, and then you could go to what some former Obama administration officials say, which is, what if we stopped ISIS before it started? Or what if we actually were involved in that in the very beginning, right? There is no question that there have been vacuums, governance vacuums, political vacuums that have allowed ISIS to be born and to surge. The question now, though, is, after all of this happens, if the Americans leave again, if you have a fight and a power vacuum then ensues, what is the next incarnation? You know, U.S. Special Operations officials were very clear when we would speak to them as recently as the last 2 weeks that they wanted to stay in northern Syria, in the sense that they saw this northern Syrian Kurds and the Arabs that they're fighting with as allies to counter Iran, which is something we haven't even talked about, right?
And it's enough tonight.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And so the whole picture gets very complicated, because do you leave if you're the United States? What do you leave if you're the United States? And can you keep a war ended?
Well, Colonel, last word to you. Why are these mistakes keep being repeated?
Because we don't have a long-term plan. We haven't had a long-term plan. We react. We don't proact. And I think the question, and what next? When you ask people at Central Command, at the Joint Task Force, you say, okay, we know that ISIS is going to be defeated. Everybody knows that. We know how it plays out. We don't have an exact idea of when, but we should be planning for what happens next. And are we going to get, as I think Lisa said, are we going to get a seat at the table? I don't know. If you ask the The Syrians, they say no. The problem with the power vacuum, I'm not sure there's going to be a power vacuum because the Russians and the Iranians are perfectly willing to fill that vacuum so that they can edge the United States out.